Welcome to the Human Rights Roundtable. It's deep dives into the work of the Human Rights Task Force. I'm your co-host, Melinda Garfield.
And I'm Danielle Sutton.
And we are talking today to Mandy Taft-Pearman. Thanks for joining us, Mandy.
Good to see you.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the Human Rights Task Force and when you were appointed?
Sure. I believe I joined in the fall of 2021, and it followed a conversation that I'd had with Danielle and some outreach to Chris, based on sort of a hat I wear in the community, which is as one of the co-founders of Inclusive Westwood. And based on that, I'd reached out with interest about what the Human Rights Task Force was going to be working on, with a belief that this is an important area of focus for our town, and a hope that I could learn more about what the task force was doing, but also if there was a place that I could be helpful, was eager to do that and to learn more. So that led to a few more conversations and then ultimately to me joining the task force.
Awesome. For those of listeners who don't know, could you tell us what is Inclusive Westwood?
Sure, happy to do so. So we are a community group. We are focused on having Westwood be a safe, equitable, welcoming, and inclusive town for all kids and families. We are, citizens of the town ourselves who are eager to do the work and ensure that our town and officials, schools, et cetera, are equipped and able to bring that perspective to making Westwood a truly inclusive place.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about how it started and when it started? And
Sure. I mean, it is, like so many, I think, grassroots, volunteer-driven efforts. It was sort of an evolution more than a clear starting point. I would say it grew out of a couple kind of community experiences, if you will, or world experiences. For me personally, it began with engaging with my kids' school and just understanding the ways, in terms of the curriculum and the school community, that topics of inclusion, diversity, equity were being brought to bear. The couple things that really led to my getting connected with other parents and community members who cared about these topics, and ultimately to the formation of this group, I would say one was in the lead up to and the discussions that happened after the 2016 presidential election. As we know, there was quite a lot going on in our country related to topics like this and discussion. And I think a sense among folks in Westwood that we really needed to think about what that kind of national discourse meant for our community, for the different populations within our community. And I think a sense from many people that they wanted to get more involved. And so I would say 2017 was sort of when the effort first started. It was kind of over the next year or two that it coalesced into an ongoing initiative that includes both kind of a listserv that serves a purpose of connecting folks in the community who care about these issues to each other on opportunities for learning, events, et cetera, and then to actually kind of hosting and holding certain events over time, driving certain initiatives. And I would say, there has been a second major external event that has, I think, led to growth in the group and some of our aspirations was in the summer of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd and the, again, deeper focus on a country basis around issues of race and such, that led again to folks kind of reflecting in my own community, what does this mean? How can I get involved, et cetera.
Sure. Can you describe some of the types of programming that you have done in the past and maybe some of the services, I guess if you call them services or just programs or events, that Inclusive Westwood has offered the community?
Sure. So I'll give a couple examples. Last summer, so the summer of 2021, we had what we called the Inclusive Westwood Summer Series. And really the goal was to create different opportunities for community members to come together and learn about or connect on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And so there were 4 different sessions that included. One was during June, which is Pride Month, and it was focused on the lived experiences of transgender Americans. And we watched some excerpts of a movie and discussed them, had a group discussion facilitated by somebody who's an expert on these topics. Second was a book discussion on the book Caste. So folks may know it, but it looks at, parallels across many different countries of different kinds of caste systems. And that was facilitated by Latifah Frank, who is Westwood's vet co-director. And that event was put on in collaboration with them. There was also a Juneteenth event that we did in collaboration with Hale and the METCO program that was bringing together some sort of improv actors, I guess it is, who actually do a performance that is both ideas they bring, but then actually engaging the audience, et cetera. And then the fourth was a discussion of Tracy Chee's book, which the full high school read about the Japanese American experience during World War II. And that we actually had her join us as an author and a discussion then with her that was hosted by the Westwood Library. So that's an example of sort of a series that we put on in collaboration with some other community players. I would say other things that we do monthly, we have roughly monthly, probably 10 months of the year, we have a standout in support of standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and against other forms of oppression and hate. That's something that we try to do regularly. We also have currently underway a effort to gather signatures in support of a DEI statement here in Westwood. I'm actually pleased to say that today we hit 1,000 signatures, February 15th. So I'm excited about that. And the goal there is really just to show the depth and breadth of commitment in Westwood to these topics as, critical to what it actually means to be a strong community.
How did your statement differ from the statement of the Hrtf?
Yeah, so I'm a part of both groups. So obviously I think they were fairly aligned. I would point to a couple differences. One is that the Inclusive Westwood statement, because it wasn't being written by a town entity, includes a call to action, right? So it actually says, we hope that we will see action from different town officials, different town bodies, select board, school committee, other, employees, and things that are about really committing resources, setting goals, committing to learning agendas, doing audits, et cetera. So really pushing for some specifics in terms of those kinds of commitments and investments. And I think obviously written from a different vantage point of the select board or the Human Rights Task Force as part of the town infrastructure. I think another thing is that we purposefully set out to gather, hundreds, ideally at least 1,000 signatures. And so up in the front part of it, we really make a point to talk about the diversity of the Westwood community. And so if you read it, it says, we the undersigned represent, and across a whole bunch of different dimensions, it lists across race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, the variation in our community. And what's really great is we did collect in part of the signature gathering statement, it was optional, but we had folks respond to demographic questions. And as we expected, all of those categories are represented and more in terms of the diversity within Westwood, which we felt like was important in that, Westwood hasn't historically always been the most diverse town or had its diversity celebrated. And it felt like it was really important to call out that DEI isn't just sort of an intellectual exercise that we're asking the town to think about or to have taught in our schools. It's actually about the lived experience of many of our current community members. And it's critical for those different groups to feel seen and supported and recognized, and to ensure that our kind of learning as a town in our schools and our policies are thoughtful about the breadth of community members we have today, and that I think we will continue getting to be a more diverse town. And I think that felt important from an Inclusive Westwood perspective to have be part of the statement. And then there's some other sort of subtle differences, but I would say those are a couple I would call out.
You've hit the 1,000 signature mark. Does this stay open and continue? Can residents continue to sign onto that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We are going to pull up and publicize the list of names now that we've hit 1,000. That was always part of the plan, something that as people signed their name, we were clear. So we're going to take advantage of this milestone to share the list. That said, we are going to leave it open so that additional people can share, since we expect some folks may learn about it for the first time. And I think we have to reflect a bit on how long we keep it open. I don't know if it will be forever, but a desire to really be able to capture the full breadth of support. And then, probably as we reach additional milestones, we'll seek to publicize it again. But yes, we will be sharing that, and there will be continued opportunity to sign it in the weeks to come.
Great. Fantastic.
What are some of the future plans of Inclusive Westwood that you and your group have been talking about?
Yes, so Inclusive Westwood is all volunteer. I should just name, we are not yet an official 501c3, and we don't have employees or a budget, et cetera. And so I think one of the questions is whether we want to formalize ourselves a bit as an organization. So a handful of folks are thinking about that. So that may be an initiative of whether we actually want to apply for 501c3 status and such. The additional initiatives that we're considering, I would say, range and are similar in tone, in flavor to what we've done before. So one is that we've really tried to lean into supporting efforts in the schools or PTOs who are seeking to engage on these topics with their families, et cetera. And so that's something where we're thinking about what kind of joint programming might we help develop that's around supporting families and kids engaging on topics of diversity, equity, inclusion with their kids. That's something that we've heard would be very helpful for members of the community to kind of have some additional supports and learning experiences. So I think that's one possibility. A second is that we are going to be doing similar summer series type events. I don't know if it'll look quite the same, but the idea that there's an opportunity to bring people together around a film, a book, an article, kind of on the topics where we can do some sort of shared learning and discussion. And so we're going to be continuing to look for opportunities to do those kinds of events as a resource to the community. And then I think it's really going to depend on the interest of our members. So one of the things, as with so many volunteer efforts, within the broad mission of the effort, people have energy and excitement. One of the things we're talking about that we've not decided on yet is whether we might help host a candidate forum in advance of the April town elections. We're not political in terms of picking candidates or anything like that, but we do think it could be valuable to help surface more information on different candidates' perspectives on DEI. So we're considering whether we might take that on. That would be a new thing that we haven't done before, but those are some examples.
Great. Do you get called, and this was a question that I just asked Rabbi Micah, but because the Hrtf is in its infancy and we have not established rules on how to engage with the members, does the Inclusive Westwood group, do you get called on when some type of problem happens within the community?
Yes, I do. I would say more with my Inclusive Westwood hat on than because they would say I'm a member of the Human Rights Task Force. But yes, and it's often, I would say the outreach takes a couple forms. Sometimes it's that somebody's had a personally tough experience, either because of some element of their identity and how they were treated or how their child was treated. So that's one flavor of conversation I sometimes have. Another is that there's often sort of people that want to talk strategically about how you might talk about DEI issues, how you might engage a neighbor, a fellow parent at your kid's school, the principal at your kid's school. How might you engage on those topics? Either sort of proactively to provide support and resources, or because a challenging event has happened or a problematic event has happened. And so I would say I hear about it in that sense too. And then I would just say, the nature of the work Inclusive Westwood is trying to do, many of the folks of us who are active, it's because we have some personal experience with these topics. I'm part of a two-mom family. There are other families of color, et cetera, who, unfortunately, I would say pretty much everybody I know in some of those different categories has had at least one experience in town that is not affirming of their identity being fully sort of supported and seen within the community. So there's a lot of personal stories and experiences there that many of those conversations are just about sort of sharing and empathy and support as opposed to action. But those are the different kinds of ways I get reached out to about it.
Okay. In what ways do you see that we can make improvements in our community? I know we have done a little bit of this work in our Human Rights Task Force meetings where we've identified some of the unmet needs. What are some of the ones that you have added, or where are real improvement areas?
You're saying, like, where's the work to be done?
Where's the work to be done?
Yes. So I have thoughts on where there's work to be done. And I also want to be clear that I'm not an expert, right, on how to be a town that is deeply grounded in DEI work. So I think as much as anything, I have thoughts on the how that we should go about asking that question and how we can learn more. On the town front, I think it's about reviewing our policies and practices to assess where we might inadvertently be undermining either certain populations' ability to fully participate or have blind spots in terms of the implications a given policy may have on a certain part of the community. And there are many other towns out there doing this work. And so what I would hope to see Westwood do is to lean into what's available out there, either in the form of a tailored equity audit of our town, or drawing on resources from other towns to say, what does it look like to be a community that's proactive here? What do our HR policies need to be for our town employees? How does zoning affect who is able to move to our town and who isn't? How do we think about affordable housing, recognizing all the ways in which race and socioeconomic status play through that if you look at sort of our country's history? Those are the kinds of questions I would want us to ask that to my knowledge, we have not done a lot of deep digging and reflection within Westwood, and I would hope that we would do some of that. I know there's been some, but I think we probably have a fair amount of work to do. And then in the schools, similarly, I think that, and this is where the schools are undertaking a DEI audit. I believe there's sort of an RFP out currently that I think will be very helpful in sort of looking, okay, the culture of a school, how do you think about these topics, the curriculum, the workforce, the teachers, the administrators, what are the things that you need to be thoughtful about in terms of policies and practices? And I would just say, areas that I know the school has been looking at these are things like curriculum. How do you look at culturally responsive teaching, right? So thinking about the different backgrounds and experiences kids will have and how that influences how they might learn and interact with history. Teaching teachers how to engage groups in age-appropriate ways in complex conversations around identity, right? We know that kids have conversations about their identity. We know that tough topics like political differences, et cetera, come up in conversations with kids. And so in my mind, the question is, are we letting them have those sort of outside of school in unsupported ways? I can tell you that, at least at the elementary school level, the conversations I hear the kids having on these topics are not very thoughtful or sophisticated. They actually need the support of trained adults who are equipped to say, how do we have these conversations in ways that respect the range of experiences and opinions and backgrounds and family situations that kids have? And so teacher training is one of the things that I think is really important as a part of this work. And so those are just a few of the examples. I think we just have room to go as a town to actually having consciously even sort of name the priorities on these and then to have a real plan to kind of work through them. And it takes time. Nobody, I think, expects that this is an overnight process, but what I would like to see is sort of sustained and clear commitment to this work and a learning orientation that we as a town have a lot of learning to do about what it means to be a truly welcoming and inclusive town.
Did going back to, I know I'm jumping around for a second, but going back to the letter that was signed, what type of, or if any, did you get any pushback from any of the residents? Obviously, there's 1,000 signatures, so that speaks volumes. But what kind of pushback and what were they pushing back on exactly?
Yes, good question. So we have had some pushback to the statement. I would say it's come in two forms, and it mirrors, to the extent there's pushback in the town on these topics, I think it mirrors those topics. So the two ways we've gotten pushback on the signatures, one has been, there was an article written in the Patch, I think, about this effort, and there was an anonymous comment from a John Doe, who was very critical and implied that talking about these topics is divisive in and of itself. So that's kind of one lane of feedback. There's also, as part of the outreach campaign, we emailed pretty much every parent in the Westwood Public Schools, not in mass, but through, from parents of 10th graders at this, at the high school to other 10th graders, et cetera. And we got some fairly nasty responses, not very many, but a handful. And I think, one of the themes there is around, again, there's a little bit of this divisive, we should stop talking about race, that's what makes it divisive. There's also been pushback around sort of indoctrination, this belief that we're teaching, by teaching in my mind, in culturally appropriate and responsive ways, and about the actual complex history of our country, that we are indoctrinating kids, and that is not something that should be done in the schools. I think in general, I would say, if I can just kind of comment on a few of the themes of pushback in the community, if that's okay.
Please.
So one theme of pushback is this claim that we are teaching critical race theory or race in our schools, and that's a critical race theory in our schools. And I would say, first of all, and there's lots of debate, like, we're not actually teaching that. It's a graduate level curriculum. This district has explicitly said we're not. That said, I actually think that's besides the point if we're teaching CRT or not. What the argument's about is, are we talking about race in school or not? And I think that's the argument. And the folks who are saying CRT basically mean they're talking about race in school, and should you talk about race in school? And I do think that's an area where Inclusive Westwood is quite clear, and I'm quite clear as a person. I believe race should be talked about in school. It's been tremendously influential in the history of our country and in the experience millions of people have had, and it endures as a driver of all kinds of things in our country, like wealth gaps, like health disparities. And there's data. If you strip out race and you control for, or if you strip out all other factors and look at race, that accounts for disparities on health, on wealth, on a whole set of other social outcomes. And so I believe we have to talk about it. And when people say it's divisive to talk about race, I think that generally comes from folks who haven't had to talk about race because they're in the majority and generally have not had to talk about race. It hasn't affected their life in the way it has affected other people's lives. Or who, quote Martin Luther King's statement about someday his children it won't be about the color of their skin, but the content of the character. That was an aspirational statement. That was not a we should not talk about race statement. That was not implying that race didn't matter. So that's kind of one thread of pushback. I would say a second thread of pushback is kind of the equity versus equality debate. So some folks say, we believe in equality. Everybody should be treated equal, not this equity stuff. And what that gets at, that I think a lot of people may not realize is, equality is about treating everybody equally. Equity is about treating everybody so that they get what they need, so that they have the same chance at the same outcomes, right? To equal outcomes, equitable outcomes. And so what that means is special needs kids or kids with learning differences, physical differences, get the kinds of supports in schools that they need. As we know, we have a very strong CPAC community in Westwood. I don't know if folks realize that equity is at the heart of those support and services. It does also mean that kids who are kids of color are being taught in ways that recognize the role race has played in their lives, either them directly or ancestors or others, right? So it meets them with an education that meets their needs so that they can learn. It means LGBTQ kids being able to show up as themselves and not be bullied or mistreated in school. And that means acknowledging their existence, not just in middle school and high school, but in elementary school. So that's what equity is about. And it's true. It's not about treating everybody equally. It's treating everybody and ensuring they have what they need to be active members of this community, active members of the school community, whatever it might be. And so that's, I would say, a second area of pushback. And then third is, I would just say, unfortunately, on the LGBTQ front, there's been debate about the level of, quote, appropriateness of talking about LGBTQ issues. This is in particular in the schools. And on that front, I personally, as an LGBTQ person, that's somewhat painful, I will just name. It's very established that we exist. We are a part of every community across race, demographic, all kinds of things. And that the public schools are it's not just the right thing to do, they're actually legally mandated to ensure that LGBTQ kids have all that rights and access and privileges of an education. In Massachusetts, that's the law. And so the pushback that we're hearing is, again, about appropriateness of talking, is how it's framed. And I think in elementary school, there's been some pushback to, apparently there's been some conversations that reference transgender kids, which again, we have in our community. We have transgender kids, and it's been portrayed as equivalent to sex ed, which it's not, to be clear. being transgender is about a gender identity, has nothing to do with sexuality, and it's being conflated with sex ed, and so therefore somehow implied that that's not okay to talk about in elementary school. And then I would say, in middle school, high school, it's pushback about sort of portrayal of LGBTQ relationships as part of the literature kids are reading, et cetera. And again, the pushback tends to be, ostensibly about what's appropriate. When you sort of say this middle schooler read something with two girls kissing, isn't that inappropriate? I would argue that there's plenty of books that have kissing in them at the middle school level. And generally those aren't seen as inappropriate. So I think what the person's talking about is that it's two girls kissing, and that's what actually the issue is about. And so, on those set of topics, I think there's just continuing discomfort. And as we know, the movement around sort of equal rights and recognition for LGBTQ people, we are still on a journey in that way as a community. And I think Massachusetts and the country have come a long way, but I think unfortunately in this pushback, we see continuing kind of homophobia and transphobia showing up in the way the issues are raised.
All right, so my last question was, how do you suggest we bring people together to discuss hard topics?
Well, I think to come together and discuss hard topics, you need to have some base agreements that people commit to, which are around mutual respect and an actual desire to listen and understand, to seek to understand. And I think, unfortunately, the environment we're in is very polarized in terms of politics, but really on any number of sort of cultural dimensions. And so in Westwood, I think for folks to come together, I think there would need to be true openness and willingness to understand the perspectives of groups that are being impacted. And I think, the part that feels complex about that maybe people don't always understand is when you're asking, say it is a community that's been disproportionately impacted by ways in which Westwood has not made progress on these issues, that's a personal ask to people to put out there. Why do I feel as an LGBTQ person I should be treated fairly? That's a personal ask. And the reality is that much of the learning of the other direction has happened as a part of our society. So I actually have learned a lot about straight heterosexual people and relationships in my life. The white American experience, the male experience, like these are things that are the dominant culture. And so I do think that the reality is to bring people together to talk about these topics requires a base agreement that there is an imbalance to begin with of what's known and understood. And that means that the conversation wouldn't just be sort of a two-sided thing. It actually would need to start with some real commitment to understanding the experiences of folks who are not in the mainstream. And I think that, unfortunately, it's not clear to me that there's interest.
I was going to say, do you think we're there? Yeah.
Frankly, it's pretty rare. I mean, I've had them in my life with people, but it's rare. I think that because that base inclination, again, I think requires people to break out of often ways they've been taught to think, right? It's not people's fault. They've been taught to think about their experience first, which again is a natural human thing. And if you're white or male or on any number of demographic characteristics, if you're in the dominant population, you've mostly not had to think about what that means, the ways that it has benefited you. And I think it can be very hard and painful for people to start to question that, to start to think that they didn't earn whatever they've had all on their own, or that even if they've had challenging things in their life, that maybe they didn't have, racial discrimination as a challenge. Maybe they had other challenges, but they didn't have that one. And I think that can be, if people haven't done some personal reflection to be open to that, to be open to considering the ways in which the dominant sort of experience, Christian, male, white, might have sort of blindfolded them to some of what others have experienced. If they're not willing to start with that, then I think it's hard to have this conversation, because again, there's this underlying imbalance of what it has meant to be in some of these other groups. Your entire life, you've been responsive to and adapting to a world that treats other things as the norms. And so I think that's what you would need to be able to have these conversations in a meaningful way that might actually lead to progress, versus sort of a debate of sorts. And I don't have a lot of hope that a debate changes many minds or moves people along. I guess that's where I land.
Great. Well, that's good. I was just laughing, thinking, yeah, like, when has a debate, ever? I know that I think of debate teams, right, and stuff like that, and the whole idea is to persuade, and it does not seem to be the reality of how debating or debates actually work. It seems that
Right.
people change when they have if there's going to be change, that change happens when they have an opportunity for like a longer term individual relationship, right? With some people tend to change their beliefs about or change their positions based on relationships with other people, and then but not necessarily like the broader idea of a group. I think it's really interesting to think about what is the most effective way to engage people if your aim is to change.
I agree, Danielle. I think people need sort of handholds almost to enter into this. And I think often if you yourself have experienced some kind of discrimination or mistreatment, that can be a really helpful angle in. So, for example, I'm a white woman, but because I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, there are times where I can tap into my own actually like personal experience and emotion about what it feels like to be kind of not feel like I belong in a setting. Like, I can use that to help me understand, well, how might it feel if I'm the one Black person in a room full of white people, or if what are ways, and it just gives you a way to start thinking about it and to start to make it a little bit more human. And I do think you're right that the way largely people make progress on these topics are to have some kind of personal relationship or insight into why it's important to wrestle with these, because it's not pleasant, a lot of this work, if you've been in the dominant culture, to reflect on how you might have benefited in ways that others didn't, or ways you might have contributed to the negative experiences of others. It doesn't feel good, and so it's an ask.
Or that your parents have too. I think that's another thing where people reach back and go, well, I was brought up this way, and then you're not going to think poorly about your own parents or your grandparents, but it's
Exactly.
usually things are passed on, I guess, in some respect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are, just one quick
please.
recommendation. I think one framework that I've seen that's been useful in talking about when you do try to talk about these topics is it's something called courageous conversations. And there's different flavors of that. I think the schools have done something. I'm actually thinking about a different framework that talks about that there are sort of 4 ways in which people often enter these kinds of conversations. One is intellectual. That's where maybe the debate approach would work, right? Mm-hmm. People that are intellectual and want to debate history or facts. There's a moral angle that a lot of people enter at. There's a social angle, sort of more emotional, how I feel. And then there's like an action-oriented angle, right? Okay, so this happened. What should I do about it? And I do think often what's missing is sort of the reality that in conversations, people don't either know where other people are coming from, or are less self-aware about the conversation they're needing to have. And the reality is all of those dimensions matter when you're talking about race or sexual orientation or religion or physical ability, right? Like, those things all matter. And so if there were to be conversations to try out, I think we'd want to be quite thoughtful about kind of the container that we're setting up for those conversations.
Yes, I agree. Well, thank you, Mandy, for joining us on episode 4 of the Human Rights Roundtable. I will leave you with a quote that I just came up with.
Nice.
This one is from Franklin D. Roosevelt. It reads, "Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights or keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose. To that high concept, there can be no end save victory. And again, thank you for joining us, and look for future podcasts coming your way in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Melinda. And thank you, Mandy.
Thank you.